They wanted me to be their perfect fall guy, a broken scapegoat for a fire I never lit. But they made one fatal mistake. They turned me into a ghost, and ghosts have a way of haunting the people who tried to bury them. The accusations didn't come as a roar. They came as a slow, suffocating tide of whispers. It started with the missing ledger, then the botched merger, and finally, the quiet, pointed stares in the break room that turned into icy silence whenever I entered a room. At first, I tried to defend myself. I pulled up emails, cross-referenced timestamps, and dragged my supervisor into my office to show him the digital footprints of someone else's incompetence. He didn't even look at the screen. He just adjusted his tie, sighed that heavy, performative sigh of a man burdened by my obvious distractions, and told me to take the rest of the week off to get my head straight. By the time Monday rolled around, the locks on my office door had been changed, and my corporate badge was rejected by the turnstiles with a flat, insulting red blink. I wasn't just fired. I was the scapegoat designated to burn for a fire I hadn't lit. I spent the next 3 days sitting in my living room, watching the walls close in. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Legal threats, passive-aggressive inquiries from HR, and the frantic, accusatory texts of colleagues who had been my friends only a week prior. They were all too happy to throw me to the wolves to keep their own comfortable seats. I felt a strange, cold detachment settling over me. It was the feeling of a glass shattering, sharp, violent, and utterly final. I looked at the life I had built, the meticulously curated existence of a high achiever, and realized it was nothing more than a costume that had become too tight to breathe in. I didn't want to fight them anymore. I didn't want to explain. I just wanted the world to stop looking at me. That evening, I walked to the kitchen, opened the junk drawer, and took out a pair of scissors. I walked over to my desk, sliced my credit cards into jagged, useless plastic confetti, and felt the first genuine smile in months tug at my lips. Then, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, but one that felt like a summons. I ignored the call, letting it go to voicemail. I didn't care who it was. I was done with the noise. I spent the next 4 hours methodically packing a single, nondescript black duffel bag. No sentimental photos, no keepsakes, no journals. I left my laptop on the kitchen counter, open to a blank document, as if I were about to type a manifesto. Instead, I just walked out the front door, leaving it unlocked, inviting the past to drift in and find nothing but empty rooms. I had cashed a modest amount of physical cash in a safety deposit box months ago, a contingency plan for a nervous breakdown that arrived slightly earlier than expected. I drove my car to a long-term parking garage at the edge of the city, wiped it down to remove any trace of my existence, and left the keys in the ignition. I walked out into the cold, damp night air, listening to the city hum with the indifference of millions of people who didn't know I existed. I was a ghost walking among the living. I headed toward the train station, my collar turned up, my heart beating with a terrifying rhythmic liberation. I bought a ticket to a town I had only ever seen on a map, a place so small and insignificant that the corporate reach of my old life would likely fray before it ever touched the borders. I sat on the train, watching the city lights blur into streaks of neon misery, feeling the weight of my reputation falling away like dead skin. I was no longer the fraud, the thief, or the failure. I was simply a traveler. I checked my reflection in the dark window. The man staring back looked exhausted, hollowed out, and dangerous in his anonymity. I was halfway through a mental inventory of my next steps when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I stiffened, my throat constricting. I hadn't spoken to a soul in 48 hours. I turned around, expecting a conductor or a stranger asking for the time. Instead, I saw a woman I didn't recognize, her face obscured by a thick scarf, holding an envelope that looked suspiciously like the one I had left on my desk. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She slid the envelope onto the seat beside me and leaned in, her voice a jagged whisper that cut through the low rumble of the train car. "You thought you were the only one who wanted to disappear," she murmured, her eyes darting toward the back of the train as if she were being watched. "But you left a breadcrumb trail a mile wide, and they aren't just angry about the money anymore. They know exactly where you're going, and they've already sent someone to make sure you never arrive." She stood up before I could ask a single question, disappearing into the dark corridor of the next car as the train began to slow for a station that wasn't on my route. My hands trembled as I reached for the envelope. I tore it open, expecting legal papers or a threat, but inside was a single, grainy photograph of myself, taken from the inside of my own apartment at the very moment I was packing my bag. The photograph wasn't just a picture, it was a death warrant. In the frame, I was standing over my open duffel bag, the shadows in my own bedroom elongated and distorted, cast by a camera lens that had been peering through the slats of my closet door. I had been living with a predator for days, and I hadn't even smelled the rot. Panic surged through me, cold and electric, but I forced myself to swallow it down. The train was beginning to chug to a halt, the screech of metal on metal sounding like a dying animal. I shoved the photo into my jacket and stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I had to move, but where? If they were already inside my home, then away wasn't a place anymore. It was a trap. I stepped off the train onto a desolate, rain-slicked platform. The station was nothing more than a rusted lean-to in the middle of a dark, forgotten forest. I was the only one who got off. As the train's taillights faded into the fog, the silence that rushed back in was heavy, predatory. I started walking, not toward the town, but into the woods. I needed to see if I was being followed. I ducked behind a row of pine trees and crouched, my lungs burning, waiting for the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Seconds stretched into minutes. Just as I was about to convince myself that the woman on the train was a hallucination brought on by stress, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic clicking. The sound of a high-end camera shutter, followed by a heavy boot crunching onto the pavement. He didn't look like a hitman. He looked like an accountant. He was dressed in a crisp, gray windbreaker, his hair perfectly parted, scanning the platform with an air of mild, professional irritation. He wasn't searching for a ghost. He was searching for a package he had lost. I watched from the brush, barely daring to breathe, as he pulled out a phone and typed something. My own phone, the one I had supposedly left behind, chimed from inside his jacket pocket. My blood turned to ice. He hadn't just watched me leave. He had taken my identity with him. He was playing the role of the disgraced, runaway employee, and he was doing it with a terrifyingly clean efficiency. He started walking toward the edge of the woods, his gaze fixed directly on the path I had taken, as if he could smell my fear on the wind. I scrambled backward, low to the ground, moving through the thicket like a wounded animal. I needed to put distance between us, but the forest was dense and unfamiliar, a labyrinth of shadows and thorns. Every time I thought I heard the wind, it turned out to be the deliberate, steady movement of someone who knew exactly how to track a target. I reached a small, crumbling stone bridge over a ravine, the water below churning with black, hungry energy. I paused for a second to catch my breath, and that was my mistake. A beam of light cut through the trees, sweeping across the bridge with surgical precision. He wasn't just tracking me anymore. He was hunting me. I looked down into the ravine, then back toward the trees, and realized I had run myself into a dead end. I dove behind a stone pillar just as a shot rang out, not a gunshot, but the muffled thwip of a dart gun. A tiny, feathered projectile embedded itself into the wood right where my head had been a second before. I looked at the dart, the fluid inside glowing with a sickly, iridescent hue, and my heart stuttered. He didn't want me dead. He wanted me sedated, pliable, and ready for whatever recovery process the firm had cooked up for me. I could hear his footsteps now, slow, methodical, and completely devoid of urgency. He was enjoying this. He stopped just on the other side of the bridge and cleared his throat, his voice perfectly modulated, calm, and hauntingly polite. "You've made this very difficult for the firm, Arthur," he called out, his tone that of a disappointed manager. "But honestly, after the mess you made, did you really think you could just walk away? Step out, please. I'd hate to have to ruin your face before the board gets to see you." I held my breath, my hand trembling as I reached into my bag and pulled out the only weapon I had, a heavy, stainless steel travel thermos. I didn't step out. Instead, I waited until his shadow fell across the bridge, and then I hurled the thermos at the light, hoping to shatter his vision, but before the impact, I heard the metallic click of a deadbolt sliding into place behind me. The thermos slammed into the stone with a deafening, hollow clang, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he chuckled, a dry, sandpaper sound that chilled the marrow of my bones. I hadn't hit his light. I had hit the iron gate of a disused maintenance tunnel I hadn't even realized was behind me. The click I heard wasn't an escape route opening. It was a trap securing its seal. I turned frantic and saw the heavy iron grate rattle, locked tight from the outside by a mechanism that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I was boxed in. The ravine behind me, a sheer drop into freezing black water, and the man in the gray windbreaker in front of me, slowly stepping into the moonlight. He held a small black device in his hand, something that hummed with a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his watch, his posture radiating the arrogance of a man who owned time itself. "The board is very disappointed, Arthur," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "They spent months grooming you, cultivating your mistakes, ensuring every piece of the puzzle pointed toward your incompetence. You were supposed to be the perfect fall guy. A suicide note, a tragic disappearance after a breakdown, it would have been poetry. But you had to go and run, didn't you? You had to make it a spectacle." He stepped closer, his eyes devoid of any human empathy. They were like glass marbles reflecting nothing. "Do you know what happens to expendable assets who try to become independent agents?" He tapped the